What's so unconscious about the unconscious? The idea of the unconscious, or more precisely, fidelity to a certain understanding of the unconscious, is the single biggest differentiator separating psychoanalysis from other psi practices. So here we're going to look at what psychoanalysis has to say about the nature and character of the unconscious. What is the stuff of the unconscious? What are its workings? What is its product? This is still a very relevant topic. Just earlier this year, 2017, one of the world's largest Lacanian groups met for its annual congress titled About the Unconscious. And it's important because when, as Lacanians, we make bold statements like the unconscious is structured like a language, that doesn't absolve us from answering certain fundamental questions about the nature of the unconscious. Do unconscious phenomena have any meaning? If so, is that meaning decipherable or discoverable, like an unconscious wish or intentionality? And is the unconscious really structured like a language? Many over time have called bullshit on the idea of the unconscious. When psychologist Hans Eysenck opened the interpretation of dreams, he looked at the very first dream that Freud analyzes, the canonical dream of Irma's injection. But if Freud's interpretation is simply that this dream expresses a wish to be absolved of medical malpractice, what's so unconscious about that? To confound matters, at the very end of the interpretation of dreams, we find Freud admitting that whether we can attribute reality to unconscious wishes, I cannot say. So in this video, we're going to trace the historical debate about the nature of the unconscious over three key turning points: 1915, 1928, and 1960. Nowadays, pretty much everyone accepts that there are such things as unconscious thoughts. But in 1915, when Freud wrote his metapsychological essays, his aim was to distinguish the unconscious from a descriptive, subconscious, non-conscious, or a kind of second consciousness. The unconscious for Freud was more like a kind of second psychical reality, as if it existed on a separate stage or in another scene, as he described it. He saw the unconscious as a system, and how it worked with the conscious or preconscious system implied a kind of psychical economy, animated by a dynamics of interactions between psychical forces within that economy that either invested, disinvested, or counter-invested ideas or thoughts. Taken together, this meant that he could talk about a kind of meta-psychology being at work. So let's road test Freud's view of the unconscious. Let's take the simplest form of psychical inscription, an idea, a thought, a mental image. What makes it conscious or unconscious? Freud presents two options. First, the single inscription model, that is, there's a single inscription of the thought or idea, and whether it's either conscious or unconscious depends on the level of investment it receives, like a light shining on or off to illuminate the idea. This is also known as the functional hypothesis. Or second, the double inscription model. Here the same idea exists in both the conscious and the unconscious systems. It's not simply that the idea is either conscious or unconscious, but that the same idea is inscribed in each system. This is known as the topographical hypothesis. Freud recognizes that there are benefits and drawbacks to both models. What's good about the single inscription model is that it explains how something gets unconscious in the first place. It's basically a process of investment, disinvestment, and counterinvestment of ideas. But the problem with the single inscription model is that it doesn't account for how repression seems to stay in place. Wouldn't this process of investment and counterinvestment just go on and on forever? We'd be constantly buffeted by the intrusion of unconscious ideas, which would then have to be re-repressed, but which would then reappear, creating an exhausting, endless cycle for the psyche. That's not what we seem to find. So how can we explain the apparent fixity of repression? What's good about the double inscription model is that it explains how we can still accept an idea while recognizing that it also works unconsciously. To take an example from Freud's clinic, little Hans' conscious phobia of horses might be linked unconsciously to his father, but it's not like his father was completely obliterated from Hans' consciousness. But the problem with the double inscription model is that it doesn't explain why we can't budge repression simply by pointing this out. Just telling little Hans that his conscious phobia was linked to unconscious ideas about the father wouldn't have made him any less afraid of horses. Something was holding the repression in place. So what Freud has to do to solve this problem is to understand the counter-investment, or anti-cathexis as it's been translated, that gives weight to one idea or another, allowing one to stay conscious and another unconscious. This is where the theory of libido, or drive, and the importance of having a dynamic model of the relation between the unconscious and the conscious, a metapsychology, becomes super important. Fast forward to 1928 and the publication of Georges Politzer's Critique of the Foundations of Psychology, a book that was to have a huge influence on a generation of French psychology students. Politzer's idea was that this metapsychology that Freud came up with was unnecessary and horribly abstract. The unconscious for him is a first-person drama. To describe this, you don't need a psyche populated by personified warring agencies like an agency of censorship or repression, or little egos and ids that oppose one another. You don't need a separate scene or stage, or second inscriptions of ideas that point to hidden meanings, as if a second text were behind them. A dream, for instance, says Politzer, has only one text. There is no hidden meaning, no disguise at work. Let's look again at the dream of Irma's injection from the interpretation of dreams. For Politzer, Irma's sore throat in that dream explains Freud's wish for a mistaken diagnosis in the same way that the French term père explains the English term father. They're just two ways of saying the same thing. So the dream isn't a derivative of a psychical conflict, and it doesn't imply the existence of a separate scene or stage. It's just the same idea expressed differently. Politzer has a nice comparison to illustrate this. The manifest content of the dream, that is, the bit we remember when we wake up, is to the meaning of the dream like a play is to its theme. We don't find the theme of a play written down somewhere in a second text. It's immanent to the play itself. Just like the laws of gravity aren't written down in nature, they're inherent to nature itself. They don't have their own existence as such. This is kind of a helpful idea because it reminds us to avoid a reification of the products of the unconscious, as if there existed some independent meaning of a dream with its own ontological status, as if it were waiting for the skilled psychoanalyst to pluck it from the depths. Politzer reminds us that an unconscious wish is not a thing. But, as a good phenomenologist, Politzer wants to retain a place for the first-person subjective aspect of a dream. His real target is any form of abstraction in psychology, and he thought Freud's metapsychology had created just that. He thought we could pinpoint where psychoanalysis started going off the rails. Over the course of the interpretation of dreams, we see Freud gradually replace the I, the personal aspect so much at the forefront in the interpretation of the dream of Irma's injection, with a metapsychology populated with impersonal agencies like the censorship, and later the ego and the id and the life and the death drives, etc. But, if Politzer were right, what's so unconscious about the unconscious? On Politzer's description, it no longer seems to have different rules to that of consciousness. It's no longer a separate scene or stage. There's nothing really unconscious about Politzer's unconscious. Let's say we junk all the Freudian metapsychology and the theory of psychical dynamism. What Politzer actually leaves us with is the assumption of an intentionality to the unconscious. That is, the dream still has a meaning, and that meaning is communicated in the form of a wish. This unconscious intentionality can be expressed in the form, I wish that... Now we're in 1960, and with Politzer's critique still ringing in their ears, the sleepy French town of Bonneval plays host to a conference of psychoanalysts devoted to the unconscious. Lacan is there, as are two of his students and adolescents, Jean Laplanche and Serge Leclerc. Up step Laplanche and Leclerc to deliver the standout paper of the conference, The Unconscious, a Psychoanalytic Study, which is later published in 1966, the same year as Lacan's Écrit. It's fair to say that Lacan didn't like what he heard from his students. He spent the next 10 years bitching about how it was either completely wrong or a misappropriation of his own theory. More on that later. But Lacan actually delivered a response at the conference itself, which was later rewritten in 1964 and is published in the Écrit as Position of the Unconscious. Laplanche and Leclerc confront Politzer head-on. Politzer can keep his phenomenological theory, they say. Just because the mechanisms of the unconscious are impersonal doesn't mean the formations or products of the unconscious are in any way less personal. But that doesn't mean we have to assume some kind of a priori unconscious intentionality, the existence of an unconscious wish that can be expressed with the first-person pronoun. To show this, Laplanche and Leclerc take a Lacanian orientation that leans, as does Lacan himself, on structural linguistics and in particular the works of Jacobson and Saussure. Their argument is that there's an operational equivalence between the processes of the unconscious and linguistic processes. The mechanisms that Freud thought characterized the unconscious, condensation and displacement, can be aligned to the mechanisms that animate language, metaphor and metonymy. In fact, the creation of the unconscious itself can be accounted for by understanding primal repression as a metaphoric process. If metaphor is a substitution, metonymy is a bridge. And to demonstrate this, Leclerc offers a brilliant analysis of a dream by his patient Philippe, which we'll call the unicorn dream. After overindulging on salty Baltic herrings one evening, Philippe's dream seems to fulfill a wish to quench his nocturnal thirst. But Leclerc recognizes that this is a Trojan horse. Getting Philippe to put the images he sees in the dream into words reveals that the dream is constructed around a series of what Freud labels switch words, that is, signifiers unhinged from their referent. The dream is created through an elective assumption of certain signifiers which link several ideas together: an identifying mark of nomination, an identifying mark on the body, and themes of sexual desire and potency that combine a female acquaintance with the myth of the unicorn. Without going into more detail, the important thing that Leclerc demonstrates is that the dream can have a meaning, but that doesn't mean it communicates an intentionality, a wish. So, what's Lacan's problem with this? Well, what Laplanche in particular was saying contradicted some aspects of Lacan's interpretation of Freud. For Laplanche, the stuff of the unconscious is not exactly signifiers, nor presentations of things. They're thing presentations, as Freud says. They refer only to themselves. The unconscious is also not a chain of signifiers, but a bricolage of different elements: memory traces, auditory visual impressions, partial object presentations. They can't all be reduced to signifiers, especially not linguistic signifiers. Lastly, the unconscious is not structured like a language. The unconscious isn't structured at all. Lacan's riposte came in 1969, when another one of his students, Annika Lemaire, went to interview him about this debate for her book, Jacques Lacan. You can find a summary of their conversation in the appendix, and Lacan himself writes the preface. But despite their differences, the thing that Lacan, Laplanche, and Leclerc all agree on is the double inscription model of the unconscious. Two registrations of the same text, the same idea in two separate systems. Laplanche and Lacan both use different analogies to help explain the double inscription model. Laplanche compares it to an optical illusion, like this one, where we see the image of Napoleon disguised within the scene of his grave. At one level, we can just shift our attention back and forth between the image of Napoleon and the random arrangement of leaves on the tree. But wouldn't this seem to correspond to the way Freud describes the single inscription model? It's effectively the same as the light shining on or off an idea, an alternating investment by either the conscious or unconscious systems. But Laplanche actually uses this illusion to illustrate the double inscription model by putting the focus on Napoleon's hat. It's the hat that he calls the load-bearing point, which makes the figure in the leaves recognizable as Napoleon. It's on this iconic hat that the whole investment of the Napoleonic legend is focused. He calls it the isolated equivocal element because it's effectively inscribed twice. First in the figure of Napoleon and the whole context of the Napoleon legend. Second, amongst the leaves on the tree, which act like a kind of counter-investment, hiding the hat in plain sight. The hat is still there, materially, in two separate contexts, whether we notice it or not. This is why Freud says that repression operates in a highly individual manner. While this may sound quite abstract, what Laplanche's analogy neatly shows is how the repressed and the return of the repressed are essentially two sides of the same coin. A single element, like the hat, is seized upon and made an organizing part of a dream or a symptom, for example. Lacan, meanwhile, thinks he has a far simpler analogy for the double inscription model. Imagine, he says, you're in a desert and you come across a large obelisk covered in hieroglyphics. You don't know what it says, but you do know that the little images of birds and crouching men probably don't mean it's just talking about birds and crouching men. The hieroglyphs are signifiers. That is, they don't point to themselves, but to other signifiers, other hieroglyphics on the obelisk, instead of to a fixed signification. So now imagine you have the same hieroglyph, for example, the little bird, on the other side of the same obelisk. Its signification will change from one side to the other depending on the context it's placed in, the other signifiers that surround it. So we have the same signifier present in two different batteries. Both analogies are useful. The status of the unconscious as a separate scene or stage is maybe a bit clearer in Lacan's analogy, but Laplanche's is better at highlighting the importance of libidinal investment that's so important to Freud's metapsychology. So, what can we say about the unconscious? Maybe three things by way of conclusion. 1. The unconscious is a dynamic system characterized by a series of processes that operate according to fundamentally different rules to those of consciousness or pre-consciousness. 2. The unconscious can be said to transmit a meaning, but this meaning does not imply an intentionality, like an I wish that ... If we're talking about unconscious meaning, we're never going to find it in the form of a wish. Instead, it has a complex, contradictory, and combinatorial character. 3. We can think of the unconscious as a text, a phenomenon of meaning, Laplanche says, but with no communicative finality. But perhaps the best description of what's so unconscious about the unconscious comes from Leclerc in his 1970 article La réalité du désir. The unconscious, he says, isn't like the harmonics of a melody line or the counterpoint of a fugue. He says it's like the kind of jazz that you hear behind a song when your radio isn't properly tuned in. What's unconscious is not a message, not even a strange or encrypted message, but like this kind of jazz, this interference with the surface or foreground. You could think of it as like a text that's been written over by another text, or an image on a canvas that's been painted over and replaced with another. Like Lacan describes the hieroglyphs and Laplanche describes Napoleon's hat, it's a different text or scene written or painted in a different context. But it's still there,